In last video, I showed you how to use the default HTTP client, how to create and use a named client or a typed client, and I laid out a few problems with each of those HTTP client usages, and I presented you with my solution to make sure that multiple HTTP clients wouldn't get mixed up. However, I ended that video with one problem still unsolved, and that problem we can tackle with one of .NET 8's new features, .NET 8's KeyedServices. What I did in last video was to create specific HTTP clients, some kind of wrappers that had their own configuration, and stored that instance of the HTTP client, and then in every service that needs to call that API, you could simply inject that specific HTTP client, and then I registered them. So the utils HTTP client, which has certain responsibilities like authorization and more, so the auth service uses that one. And then I had another HTTP client for the pets that had to call another API. So that's basically the same thing, just a different API URL. But this had one more problem. This works fine as long as we're working within this application. Then we can easily use that interface or that interface. But once we're using a third-party module, like a NuGet package or just your own module that shouldn't have to know about the projects that's going to implement it, then the problem starts, because in that third-party module, you might have a service that also needs to do an HTTP call, and that needs to know which API to call, API 1 or API 2. So are we going to use the utils HTTP client or the pet service HTTP client? That's crucial to know. If we just use the HTTP client, that's not going to work, just get mixed up. And since this is a third-party module that shouldn't know about the projects that would implement it, we couldn't just say utils HTTP client. It's not a great practice, since that loses reusability of that module. So we did something like this, but that only works for as long as there's only one. So if I were to do that now with the pet service, then those HTTP clients can get mixed up again. Take a look at the utils HTTP client. It's implementing that HTTP client, which is an interface we could use. And that HTTP client just has get client and authorize client. And as you may have guessed it, the pet service implements that one as well and is actually exactly the same except for this base address. So maybe it would be an idea to do that, HTTP client. But now we kind of have the same problem as if we would just do this, because once another implementation happens, like that, once this occurs, now we lost control again over which service is going to be used in this third-party module. HTTP client, HTTP client. That would be about similar as I just showed you, which still has the mix-up problem. But these two HTTP clients are very similar. So the only reason I did this utils HTTP client and pet service HTTP client is to make that distinction, so when they get registered that I can easily use those. And be sure that the correct configuration is used. Since these classes are kind of the same, let's clean those up. And we're going to remove this iUtils HTTP client interface because we still have that third-party module problem, and that's no longer a viable way to do it. So let's inherit directly from HTTP client, but I made a base client, let's say base client, which basically contains all of the below and implement that iHTTP interface. And now that needs a base, and we need to pass along and the name of, and then the base address would be that. Let's see. Then I can remove this prop field because the base class does all of the below. It has that iHTTP client interface, it has that field, it has a constructor to create a new HTTP client, to get a client and to authorize a client. And then the pet service is gonna be this, we're gonna do the same thing. So these are actually just two initializations from the HTTP base class, but with specific values. So then this no longer exists, but we can do HTTP client, and now this is also HTTP client. And then we can use them in here, HTTP client and HTTP client. But now we still have that mix-up problem risk, but we'll solve that in a bit. I'm going to go to the extensions and also use that iHTTP client, which you'll now have to move that interface. So I moved this HTTP client to the module just for the demo. It would be better that this goes into a Nuket package that both projects can implement without having to reference each other. And now get client. And now let's actually solve the problem using KeyedServices, because now we have two implementations for that interface. So we can do, instead of add scoped, we can do add keyed scoped. And then that needs a name, so that just a string, but we can do name of, might be better, utils HTTP client. Then we do the same for this one, which makes that we now have, well, so it has to be scoped again, which makes that we now have two implementations for the HTTP client, two unique, well, two different ones at least. Now our implementation still does not know which one to use because we're just using that iHTTP client. To solve that, we can use the from KeyedServices and pass along that name, which would be name of utils HTTP client. We can do the same for this one with the pet service. So this would work for the services in this project, inside of this implementation project, but this still won't work for the third-party module because that module now needs to know about the possible names for those KeyedServices. So to solve that, we could either just pass along the name of the KeyedService to target. So for example, name of utils HTTP client. And then inside of that third-party module, we have a string HTTP client name. And then we could say something like services dot add scoped for the IHTTP client, and we're going to go into the get the required keyed service, which needs that IHTTP client, but this time with the HTTP client name. Or you could do something similar like I showed in the previous video and make that ImplementationFactory. Put that on a new line. And how you would use that, similar. Let's comment this one out. And that would be services.addScoped. Instead of the, now you use the type of. And let's see, well, just HTTP client. And then ImplementationFactory. Of course, to use that ImplementationFactory, you now go to the implementation project. And so that's gonna work as long as you don't do the same thing for the pet service, for example. So instead of this 8 utils, make this pet service. Because now we're providing another implementation for that HTTP client, so that's likely going to override each other again. But this is not a problem for my project because it does not make sense to implement this one twice within the same boundaries, if I can say it like that. That would just be a necessary duplication, both in code and functional. Another way is to reduce this type of code is to make some kind of wrapper. But in my opinion, that's not really better than just creating a iUtils HTTP client interface, because all you want to do actually with that is make that distinction. So if you register them, you do separate things and you know when you have control over which one to use. But let's just demonstrate it. HTTP client, we could say wrapper. And we could use the primary constructor. That's another new feature of .NET 8, which is just going to do the from KeyedServices. Name of utils HTTP client. Let's say, and then we can have that HTTP client. Let's see, am I doing it right? Yes, like that. So now you have a new class with the with this injected in the constructor. So that's the shorthand notation of what I'm doing here in the constructor. And we could do the same for the pet service client. Now you could add both of these to the services, so register them by saying .add scoped. Since our other services are also scoped, and we're going to use that wrapper inside of this auth service. So utils client wrapper, and then we could do the same for the pet service client wrapper. Like that. And then instead of using these keyed services, we can now do the utils HTTP client wrapper. We'll solve that line in a bit. And then the same for pet service HTTP client wrapper. And then to solve this line is you make these implement their respective interfaces, HTTP client. And now we'll likely have to transform it to the long form notation. Oh well, you can keep it like that, but let's just do like we're used to and use that constructor. Just wanted to show you another new feature. And then these methods. And now that would work just fine for this authentication service. But as you can see, maybe that's not that much different than using that iUtils HTTP client. Let me quickly copy all of this over for the pet service. And how would we use that? Getting that required keyed service, we can likely just do get required service and say utils HTTP client wrapper. This is basically the same as we did before with the get key required service, but we have a lot more code and this is kind of duplicate code. So we can clean that up by making just using a generic. So we could make a class and I'm gonna add a generic. I'm gonna call it tname. See about that. We're going to implement that iHTTP client. And I'm just gonna copy over. Okay, HTTP client wrapper. And now so now we can actually remove the utils HTTP client wrapper and the pet service client wrapper, since the only difference was that name. And then we could say HTTP client wrapper, and then pass along utils HTTP client, and the same in here, and then almost the same in there, but just the pet service HTTP client. That's nicely cleaned up, but there's one more problem. This name of tname is just gonna give us tname instead of the actual class name that we're expecting. And unfortunately we can't use type of and then name in here. So that's not possible because we're inside of this KeyedServices. Just service provider instead of this HTTP client. We're going to do service provider dot get required keyed service HTTP client, and then this name is gonna be now type of tname dot name, and that should work fine. Let's just move this in a variable. So that's a nice HTTP client wrapper. And now how to use it is by just using the HTTP client wrapper and pass along that utils HTTP client wrapper pet service HTTP client. And we can clean it up even further, because remember, the only difference between the utils HTTP client and the pet service HTTP client was that base address and the name of. So let's give that a go. All the rest is, it's just an initialization of the HTTP base client. So instead of, we could go in here, remove that HTTP client, and go in here, say provider. It kind of needs, if we take a look at the constructor, an HTTP factory, a name and a base address. So the name and the base address we already have, the factory not yet. So this would be name of utils HTTP client and then the URL. To get that factory, let's name. Then we need to get that from the provider. Let's see, HTTP client factory, just like that. And now we can do this. Oh yeah, I forgot the new keyword. Okay, just a new HTTP base client. And then we're going to copy that for the pet service registration as well. Just like that. And then the name of should be this. And the URL should be number 2. Remove that HTTP client. And that should be good. And now we can actually get rid of these HTTP clients. And then you see we were using those clients for the name and in this client wrapper, which actually also just wants that for its name. So this name of actually could be anything. To be able to pass it to this HTTP client wrapper, it needs to be a reference type, which means actually a class, or we could do a record. So let's say public record and just call it utils. I'm going to violate the syntax now, and then the same for the pet service, just like that. And all of these we're going to say the utils. And all of the pet service clients we're going to say the pet service. And as a last cleanup step, I want to get rid of this duplication, all of this, because whether it's for the utils or for the tpet service, it's kind of the same. The only differences again are those name and the URL. So let's make an extension method for that and say add keyed HTTP client. We can use that tname again and then string base address. Well, forgot the actual extension. So this iService collection and call it services. And then we should be able to move all of that in there. And instead of this name of these by name and the URL by base address. And even move this one in there as well to make that client wrapper or resolver available. And we're going to replace this one with the name. So now we can clean all of that up. Add keyed HTTP client and pass along the utils. And as base address, we're going to pass this one just like that. And the same in here. So this is now each time going to register for the iHTTP client, the implementation with a unique name and a unique base address. And it's going to also register that HTTP client wrapper with that same unique name. And we've got our isolated HTTP clients with their unique configuration that we can easily get back out of the service registration in whichever class we need, or component even. You just need to remember to use that client wrapper. You can't just do the utils. And we can also not use the iHTTP client. But I'm going to end the video here. If you learned something, please hit that like and subscribe button. I'm almost at 1000 subscribers. Thanks to all of you. 968. And I moved all of the code that I showed today to the HTTP client NuGet package. That wrapper is named resolver, and maybe I'm going to rename the named HTTP client to HTTP base client. I'm going to evolve these packages to my own use cases. So if you want the code to adjust to your use cases, you can get it on kisscode.com. And you can get your own copy of the NuGet packages, the original source code. Whenever you sign up, I'll make sure you get those. And if you want access to more of my code, you can go to my Patreon, where most of my code is available. I hope I see you in the next video.